Let us quickly review the gray matter, white matter, and get our bearings right. If you've watched the previous video, you should know the difference between the anterior and posterior regions of the spinal cord. So this is the cross section. Right over here is the anterior median fissure. And this over here is the posterior median sulcus. And you can see this butterfly-shaped structure. This is called the gray matter. The gray matter has very little myelinated neurons in here, and that's why it looks gray. Okay, the gray matter is surrounded by white matter around, and the white matter is white due to the fats of the myelinated sheets on the axons. Okay, so the white matter has a lot of myelinated axons, while the gray matter does not have the myelinated parts of the neuron. So the gray matter is rich in dendrites, in cell bodies, and some axon, but over here you don't see the myelin sheath. Now this is the posterior, and this is the anterior. So the posterior gray horn is the region that carries the root of sensory nerves only. Okay, so the sensory nerves enter the spinal cord from the back. So they're going to carry sensory information from the visceral and superficial organs, somatic structures, and then enter the spinal cord from the back. So right over here, you'll have a lot of sensory fibers entering. And in the gray matter, you can have a whole bunch of other neurons known as interneurons. Interneurons. Interneurons are connections from one neuron to the other. And the other end of the gray matter, you'll have the anterior or the ventral root of the spinal nerve, and the anterior or ventral root carry only motor fibers. So the motor fibers will exit the front of the spinal cord, exit from the front of the spinal cord. Now the dorsal root contains sensory nerves only, and the sensory nerve fibers are efferent neurons, meaning they carry the message from different body parts to the central nervous system. Okay, and the motor fibers are afferent neurons. Afferent neurons carry message or commands away from the brain towards the effectors. Now you see a lateral horn over here. Now the lateral horn is a small bulge, and you only see lateral horns through the T2 to L1, okay, because this region contains the sympathetic nervous system for automated control of structures like the heart and the smooth muscles, right? So in the lateral horn, you find the autonomic motor neurons exiting the spinal cord. The white matter surrounds the gray matter. So this is a stained section. That's why it looks, you know, purple and a darker blue over here. But in reality, this is the gray matter, and this is the white matter. It is called the white matter because it contains myelinated parts of the neuron, which is the axon. So the myelinated axon will be present in this area. So the white matter can be again divided into the posterior, the lateral, and the ventral column on each side. Okay, and well, as usual, the sensory nerves are always going to be entering the spinal cord from the back, and the motor neurons exit from the front. And the tracts are these regions in the white matter. So these are subdivisions, which are basically bundles of nerve fibers going towards or coming from the brain. So these bundles of nerve fibers are collectively called tracts. We can have ascending tracts or descending tracts. Ascending tracts are going to carry the message up towards the brain, and descending tracts carry the message from the brain down to the spinal cord and down again, further down to different body parts. So another word that we're going to look at today, now this is a terminology that you need to be aware of. Decussation. Decussation meaning crossing over. So when one nerve crosses over from one side of the spinal cord to the other, so from left to right, that is called a decussation. And those regions where they cross over are called commissures. And that's why you have the gray commissure, so that dark, thin region that crosses over from one side of the spinal cord to the other. And then if a nerve has opposite sides of origin and destination, just say the nerve from the right side of the body crosses over in the spinal cord and ends up in the left side of the brain, those are called contralateral spinal tracts, okay? And ipsilateral tracts is when the origin and destination of the tract are on the same side of the body, meaning they do not decussate. They do not have to cross over from the left side to the right side. Okay, that's just an example. Okay, so be aware of the word decussation. And contralateral and ipsilateral are the terms you have studied earlier during study, while you studied anatomical terms. Okay, so this is just a good way to put what you've studied to use. So again, I repeat, we have a lot of tracts, and the tracts are bundles of ascending and descending nerves in the central nervous system, neurons in the central nervous system. We have way too many spinal tracts, and when a pathway or a tract is ascending, it is always a sensory pathway or an afferent pathway, because it relays information to the hypothalamus. So it goes up to the brain and we process the information. Once the information is processed, the command center sends a command down via the descending pathway. So the descending pathways are always efferent or motor pathways that the brain sends out to the effectors like the muscles and internal organs. Okay, so ascending pathway takes info to the brain processes it, the descending pathway brings it down to the effector to do the job. Now, many neurons sorry about that. So many neurons decussate, right? The term we looked at before. Many neurons decussate, meaning they cross the midline and they are processed on the other side of the brain or the spinal cord. So decussation meaning let's say a sensory nerve entered through this side, and then they cross the spinal cord to the other side, and they're taken up to the brain. So these two nerves are contralateral, right? So they originate on one side of the body but end up in the other side of the body to be processed on the other side of the brain or spinal cord. And why is this important? Now, the origin of the neuron and the final destination of the neuron are important, because the knowledge of this helps us understand which part of the body or brain that particular nerve is affecting. So it's important to know the pathways of these tracts, okay? And the tracts have a very simple name. Let's just say the spinothalamic tract. So you have the lateral spinothalamic tract and the anterior spinothalamic tract. So the spinal thalamic tract is simple to remember. Lateral means on the side, anterior means to the front. Spinal thalamic tract is the ascending pathway of the spinal cord, hence spinal, that relays information of pain, temperature, or touch to the thalamus, hence thalamic. Right? So these are ascending, meaning sensory pathways, and these are very important pathways that relay information on a minute-to-minute basis, I should say. Okay, so the names are very easy to remember if you understand the meaning of the words over there. Okay, so we'll look at that a little later. So the spinal cord looks pretty similar in different regions of the vertebrae. And if you remember, right on the back, that is a posterior root ganglion, and this is the anterior root, or the anterior nerve that emerges from the spinal cord. So the posterior root ganglion is present very close to the intervertebral foramen, and then a whole bunch of spinal nerves emerge from here. Okay, and let's look at a few branches over here. Now the first one is the dorsal rami, or the ramus. The dorsal ramus is the branch, because ramus literally means branch. The dorsal rami emerge from the posterior aspect, and they are known as the dorsal or the posterior ramus. This ramus innervates deep muscles and skin in the posterior surface of the trunk. And then you have the ventral ramus. Rami means branch. Ventral or anterior means the front. The ventral ramus innervate the muscle. So this one in yellow is the ventral ramus. The ventral ramus innervate the muscles of the upper and lower limb and the skin of the lateral and anterior surface of the trunk. Okay, so the ventral ramus have mixed nerves, and if you think about it, you know, each nerve that emerges and goes to different parts of the body, you're going to have at least one set of motor neurons and one set of sensory neurons, right? Because one is going to be the receptor to change in stimuli, and another going to be the effector for or against the stimuli. And this one over here is the sympathetic ganglion. The sympathetic means autonomic. Okay, sympathetic nervous system or autonomic nervous system are the type of nervous system that can be broken into sensory and motor neurons. So the sympathetic ganglion delivers information to the body about stress and impending dangers, or, you know, if the fight and flight response. If your body goes through stress, the central nervous system kicks in. And we have about 20 to 30,000 nerve cell bodies that are located close to this region of the spinal cord, okay, along the spinal cord. So we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. All these nerves are mixed nerves because they contain both motor neurons and sensory neurons. We have 8 pairs of cervical nerves. Now you might be thinking, how 8 when you only have 7 vertebrae? Yes, you only have 7 cervical vertebrae, but you have 8 pairs of these cervical nerves. And the first cervical nerve emerges above the first cervical bone in between the skull and the atlas. The rest, which are, you know, most emerge from the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramina. The intervertebral foramina is the foramina in between 2 vertebrae. And C1 to C7 exit above the vertebrae, and C8, that pair, exits in between C7 and T 1. That is the first thoracic. And then we have 12 thoracic nerves. Out of these 12 thoracic nerves, T1 through T5 exit below their corresponding vertebrae. And then we have 5 pairs of lumbar nerves, 5 pairs of sacral nerve, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerve. And then we have something called as plexus. So the plexus are a network of nerves, highly complicated network of intersecting nerves that serve a particular part of the body. So a network is a plexus is basically a whole bunch of intersecting nerves where you have multiple nerves intersecting, and sometimes these nerve plexuses are comprised of both afferent and efferent nerve fibers that arise from the anterior rami of the spinal nerves, and sometimes they merge into the blood vessels. Okay, and a lot of times these nerve plexuses are named after the area in which they occur. For example, cervical plexus, you have brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, sacral plexus, coccygeal plexus, etc. So they are named after the area where the plexus occurs and the organs and tissues that these plexus serve. So we have 5 basic plexus. You have the spinal plexus. You have in the spinal plexus, you have the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and the sacral plexus. Okay, and the coccygeal plexus as well. And then you have the autonomic plexus, and we won't really go into the plexus just yet. I think I got into it too soon, but keep in mind we have so many different plexus, but it's basically a network of nerves arising from the anterior rami that merge into the blood vessels. Okay, and they're named after the part of the body where they occur and the organs and structures they supply. We're going to look at some nerve plexuses, but just focus on the nerve plexus we cover. And the first one is the spinal plexuses, and these emerge from the anterior rami and they branch or anastomose. Anastomose means branching repeatedly to form 5 nerve plexus. The first one is the cervical plexus. The cervical plexus arises in the neck, and they serve the head, neck, and shoulders. And the network of these plexus is located deep within the neck, and that's why it's called the cervical plexus. Okay, and they supply a very important nerve, the neck and the phrenic nerve that we'll look at in just a second. Then you have the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus, what is this called? It serves the chest, shoulders, arms, and hands, and they extend towards the armpit or the axillary region. Okay, an important nerve in the brachial plexus is that emerged from the brachial plexus is the median nerve, which is most strong. This is a nerve that, when gets pressed on, causes carpal tunnel syndrome, and due to obstruction or damage of this particular nerve, you might have numbness or even pain in the carpal tunnel area, right? So the lumbar plexus is present in the lower back, and the lumbar plexus serves the back, the abdominal region, the groin, the thighs, knees, calves, and the genitalia. And the lumbar plexus is will formed again from the anterior rami of L1 through L4 spinal nerves. Okay, and sometimes in the lumbar plexus you also have the T12 T12 nerve, okay, merging into the lumbar plexus. And sacral plexus is in the pelvis, buttocks, genitals, and thighs, and calves, and feet. The sacral plexus is located in the pelvic cavity, and they supply the remainder of the lower trunk and the lower limb. Then you have the coccygeal plexus. The coccygeal plexus originates from S4, S5, and coccygeal nerve, spinal nerve. And this nerve is interconnected with the lower part of the sacral plexus. And the celiac plexus is a plexus that serves the internal organs of the gastrointestinal tract as well. Okay, but those are autonomic plexuses. But what I want you to focus on is the cervical, brachial, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal plexus. So the nerve plexus have somatosensory and motor functions. For example, proprioception. When you wiggle your toes, you can feel yourself wiggling your toes, right? That is called proprioception. The brain receives information about the body position, movements from nerve endings in the muscles and tendons. So when you wiggle your toes, the somatosensory nerves carry information to the brain, where your brain processes the information to make you realize that you want to wiggle your toes, and then the motor functions of these muscles stimulate contraction in these muscles to allow you to wiggle your toes. Okay, so nerve plexuses carry somatosensory as well as motor functions from different parts of the body. Okay, so the first plexus, the cervical plexus, originates from C1 through C5 nerves, and one of the most important nerves in here is the phrenic nerve. The cervical plexus in general primarily supplies the head, neck, shoulder, and chest. What do you have in your chest? You have the heart, you have the lungs, and you have the diaphragm that help you breathe, right? So one of the most important nerves in the cervical plexus is the phrenic nerves. Okay, so this is the cervical plexus, and over here, this nerve is the phrenic nerve. This is a very, very important nerve because the phrenic nerve that arises from the cervical plexus supplies motor fibers to the diaphragm. What is the diaphragm? The diaphragm is the muscle that contracts and relaxes and helps you breathe. Okay, so this particular nerve arises anywhere between C3 to C5, and if it is damaged, everything, so if you damage the nerve, say right here, everything below this nerve gets damaged. Okay, so it disrupts impulse transmission along this nerve. So when a person suffers the damage of phrenic nerve, they must remain on ventilators permanently because these nerves won't be able to send an impulse to the diaphragm to contract and relax for breathing. So phrenic nerve is a very, very important nerve. So the next one is the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus is projected from C5 through T1 nerves, and they are responsible for sensory input from the skin and skin in the arm, and then you have so many different nerves that originate from the brachial plexus, like the radial nerve, the medial nerve that is responsible for carpal tunnel syndrome, and then you have the ulnar nerve and axillary nerve in the armpit. Now, any damage to these nerves will result in pain, numbness, or tingling sensation in the arm. Now, a very well-known condition of the damage to radial nerve is wrist drop, wherein people don't realize they suddenly lose sensation in the hand and they keep dropping stuff. That is probably due to a damage in the radial nerve. Okay. So we directly jump to the lumbar plexus because thoracic nerves don't have plexus, because these thoracic nerves are directly involved with the limb. So they don't form networks and then branch out. They are directly involved with the limb, unlike the other regions. Okay, and that's why we don't have a thoracic plexus. So next one is the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus innervates the lower limbs. So you have the femoral nerve, you know, obturator nerve, lumbosacral nerve. All of these major nerves emerge from the lumbar plexus. And the next plexus is the sacral plexus and the coccygeal plexus. The sacral plexus extends from the L4 to the coccygeal vertebrae, okay, all the way down. And these sacral plexus supply the butt, the perineum. Perineum is basically the region in between the anus and the scrotum or the vulva and the lower limb. And one of the largest nerves, well, the largest nerve in the body is the sciatic nerve, and it arises right here. The sciatic nerve is made up of two other nerves. One is the common fibular nerve and the tibial nerve. So you hear about the sciatic pain all the time, and this is the nerve that is affected when a person has the sciatic pain. So these are the plexes that originate over here, and they're called the sacral and the coccygeal plexus because they originate and supply the sacral region and the coccygeal region. Okay, so this picture shows you the overview of all the plexus and the spinal nerves. So you have the cervical plexus, brachial plexus, intercostal nerves, which is not a plexus because they directly innervate without branching out. Okay, and then you have the lumbar plexus, sacral plexus, and coccygeal plexus. Now the spinal cord actually ends right about the L1, so there's a lot more space down below where the pia mater of the meninges extends all the way down to the coccygeal vertebrae, and it attaches to the vertebrae down over here like a thin string. And that's basically the extension of the meninges. So we still have meninges all the way down. So we have cerebrospinal fluid all the way down this area. Okay, so during the lumbar puncture, they insert the needle into the space here, which is known as lumbar cisternae. So the space in here where you'll find the cerebrospinal fluid is the lumbar cisternae. Okay, so the lumbar cisternae is a good place to do a spinal tap because it reduces the chances of nerve damage in the spinal cord. Now, if you damage a nerve over here, it will still be it will still cause a person to be a paraplegic, so they'll lose the ability to walk, but it's better than causing excessive damage. And these people are extremely skilled, so they don't really normally cause damage to the nerves while they're trying to do a spinal tap. And usually this is the best place to do it. And even for administration of epidural, they're going to administer the epidural in between L3 to L4 because this is the safest place to administer the epidural without causing extreme damage. Okay, and this hair-like structure, if you remember, it is called the cauda equina because it looks like a horsetail-like structure. And cauda equina is just a bundle of nerves hanging down the end of the spinal cord. And when this is damaged, it causes low back pain that radiates down to the lower limbs, causes numbness in the urogenital region, loss of bladder control, etc. So that is called cauda equina syndrome. Cauda equina syndrome. Now, what else did I miss? Oh, so there's one thing I forgot to mention previously is the phylum terminale. So there's a little thin strand of pia mater that I told you. Pia mater is the innermost layer of the meninges. an extension of the pia mater extends from right here, where the spinal cord ends, all the way down to the coccygeal segment. Okay, so that is called filum terminale. Sorry, I should have mentioned that while we were looking at the structure of the spinal cord, but I realized I did not. So make sure you know what the lumbar cisternae is and understand the clinical importance of the cauda equina and the lumbar cisternae. So what you're looking at right now is a dermatome map. Now, dermatome map is an area. So all these areas that you see divided are areas on the skin in which sensory nerves are derived from a single spinal nerve root. For example, if you see C2 over here, this means this area of sensory nerves are supplied from the C2 spinal nerve. Okay, this one it says L1, meaning the L1 nerve, spinal nerve, supplies the sensory nerves for this area. So why is this important? Now, let's pick an example to explain that. Okay, these dermatomes are useful to locate events in neurology. For example, when a person has shingles, shingles is caused by herpes zoster virus, and this happens when you've had chicken pox and they remain dormant in the nerves and they are expressed later in life, right? So herpes zoster, which is a virus, it can lay dormant in the dorsal root ganglion, but these viruses can migrate down along the spinal nerve to be expressed on a particular area of the skin. So if you know that this is the area where, let's just say, a lot of time you find it on the back. Okay, so let's pick the front or back. So if you know that, shingles is expressed, say, in this T2 region, you know that the virus is laying dormant along the dorsal root ganglia of the T2 pair of nerve. Okay, and that's why the dermatome is important. By tracing the approximate area of the dermatome, we can trace these areas of sensory regions back to the spinal nerve itself. And that's why knowing the dermatome is important. But for your purposes, just understand what a dermatome is and the clinical significance of the dermatome. And of course, these are not, clear-cut edges. These edges overlap as much as 50%. But this gives us a good idea of, where the nerves are located. Okay. Now, knowing this area is also important to anesthetize these regions in the spinal nerve, like in case of, herpes infection or shingles infection. So with this, we've finished just the basics of the spinal nerves and the plexus.